And so that cold, dense, heavy water sinks at the rate of 5 billion gallons per second. And then that pulls that current back south. At the end of the last ice age, as the last glacier was receding from North America, the ice melted and a giant pool of fresh water formed in North America. And the Great Lakes are the remnants of that huge lake. An ice dam on the eastern border formed, and one day it broke. And all that fresh water came rushing out, ripping open the St. Lawrence there. And it diluted the salty, dense, cold water, made it fresher and lighter, so it stopped sinking. And that pump shut off. And the heat transfer stopped. And Europe went back into an ice age for another 900 to 1,000 years. And the change from conditions like we have here today to an ice age took place in perhaps as little as 10 years' time. So that's a sudden jump. Now, of course, that's not going to happen again because the glaciers of North America are not there. And is there any other big chunk of ice anywhere near there? Oh, yeah. We'll come back to that one. It's extremely frustrating to me to communicate over and over again as clearly as I can. And we are still by far the worst contributor to the problem. I look around and look for really meaningful signs that we're about to really change. I don't see it right now.
A number of very reputable scientists have said that one factor of air pollution is oxides of nitrogen from decaying vegetation. This is what causes the haze that gave the Big Smoky Mountains their name.
Thank you very much. Okay.
This guy is so far off in the environmental extreme, we'll be up to our neck in owls and out of work for every American. This guy's crazy.
Even if humans were causing global warming, and we're not, this could be maybe the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. We're dealing with something that's highly emotional.
If an issue is not on the tips of their constituents' tongues, it's easy for them to ignore it. To say, well, we'll deal with that tomorrow. So the same phenomena of changing all these patterns is also affecting the seasons. Here is a study from the Netherlands. The peak arrival date for migratory birds 25 years ago was April 25th. And their chicks hatched on June the 3rd, just at the time when the caterpillars were coming out. Nature's plan. But 20 years of warming later, the caterpillars peaked 2 weeks earlier, and the chicks tried to catch up with it, but they couldn't. And so they're in trouble. And there are millions of ecological niches that are affected by global warming in just this way. This is the number of days with frost in southern Switzerland over the last 100 years. It has gone down rapidly. But now watch this. This is the number of invasive exotic species that have rushed in to fill the new ecological niches that are opening up. That's happening here in the United States, too. You've heard of the pine beetle problem. Those pine beetles used to be killed by the cold winters, but there are fewer days of frost, and so the pine trees are being devastated. This is part of 14 million acres of spruce trees in Alaska that have been killed by bark beetles, the exact same phenomenon. There are cities that were founded because they were just above the mosquito line. Nairobi is one. Harare is another. There are plenty of others. Now the mosquitoes, with warming, are climbing to higher altitudes. There are a lot of vectors for infectious diseases that are worrisome to us that are also expanding their range, not only mosquitoes, but all of these others as well. And we've had 30 so-called new diseases that have emerged just in the last quarter century. And a lot of them, like SARS, have caused tremendous problems. The resistant forms of tuberculosis, there are others. And there's been a reemergence of some diseases that were once under control. The avian flu, of course, quite a serious matter, as you know. West Nile virus. It came to the eastern shore of Maryland in 1999. 2 years later, it was across the Mississippi. And 2 years after that, it had spread across the continent. But these are very troubling signs. Coral reefs all over the world, because of global warming and other factors, are bleaching, and they end up like this. And all the fish species that depend on the coral reefs are also in jeopardy as a result. Overall, species loss is now occurring at a rate 1,000 times greater than the natural background rate. This brings me to the second canary in the coal mine, Antarctica, the largest mass of ice on the planet by far. A friend of mine said in 1978, if you see the breakup of ice shelves along the Antarctic Peninsula, watch out, because that should be seen as an alarm bell for global warming. And actually, if you look at the peninsula up close, every place where you see one of these green blotches here is an ice shelf larger than the state of Rhode Island that has broken up just in the last 15 to 20 years. I want to focus on just one of them. It's called Larsen B. I want you to look at these black pools here. It makes it seem almost as if we're looking through the ice to the ocean beneath, but that's an illusion. This is melting water that forms in pools. And if you were flying over it in a helicopter, you'd see it's 700 feet tall. They are so majestic, so massive. In the distance are the mountains, and just before the mountains is the shelf of the continent there. This is floating ice, and there's land-based ice on the downslope of those mountains. From here to the mountains is about 20 to 25 miles. Now, they thought this would be stable for at least 100 years, even with global warming. The scientists who study these ice shelves were absolutely astonished when they were looking at these images, starting on January 31, 2002, in a period of 35 days, this ice shelf completely disappeared. They could not figure out how in the world this happened so rapidly. And they went back to try to figure out where they'd gone wrong, and that's when they focused on those pools of melting water. But even before they could figure out what had happened there, something else started going wrong. When the floating sea-based ice cracked up, it no longer held back the ice on the land, and the land-based ice then started falling into the ocean. It was like letting the cork out of a bottle. And there's a difference between floating ice and land-based ice that's like the difference between an ice cube floating in a glass of water, which when it melts doesn't raise the level of water in the glass, and a cube that's sitting atop a stack of ice cubes, which melts and flows over the edge. That's why the citizens of these Pacific nations have all had to evacuate to New Zealand. But I want to focus on West Antarctica, because it illustrates two factors about land-based ice and sea-based ice. It's a little of both. It's propped up on tops of islands, but the ocean comes up underneath it. So as the ocean gets warmer, it has an impact on it. If this were to go, sea level worldwide would go up 20 feet.